probably worthwhile now to review sort of Jack's, what are there, seven pillars of successful good covert action, and all of them were there in Afghanistan, which was, let me just say that, so Jack ran the Afghan task force, which was a task force that ran the longest, largest, and last covert action of the Cold War. This was the covert action that basically supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the late 1980s. So here are Jack's precepts for good covert action. Number one, viable partners in place on the ground. That is people in the country where you're trying to make something happen, not Ahmed Shalvi kind of exiles. Number two, real-time accurate information, a real sense of what's happening. Number three, adequate resources. Jack talks about how dabbling will only get you in trouble. If you're going to do something, do it right, fund it right. Number four, perhaps most importantly, bipartisan political support, which again, all of the successful actions of the CIA have had, many of the unsuccessful ones have not had. Five, make sure that the people you're acting against represent a direct threat to U.S. security, like a la Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in 2001. Number six, proportionality. Try to ensure that what you're doing is somehow proportional to the threat you're doing it against. And lastly, try to make sure you have a reasonable prospect for success. Sounds simple now, but not so simple in practice.
It's interesting the word Mercyhurst. I didn't realize it really doesn't take much to look up the reason to realize that this was founded by the Mercy Nuns. And I was taught by the Mercy Nuns in elementary school. And I remember them fondly. They said, what does that have to do with anything? Well, these principles are not Jack Devine's principles. I have added a couple. But these are really the arguments for what is known as the just war. This is 14th century philosophical view of the use of force and lethal force in particular. And I can cite them and they're recast here. You have to have an intrinsic evil, and you have to have exhausted all other possibilities. You have to have a chance of being successful. You have to minimize the bloodshed. This is going to the proportionality. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, in the 14th century, bipartisanship wasn't a big issue. Maybe it feels a bit like that nowadays. But so I have added what I would consider, or funding. Again, this is not an issue of the 13th, 14th century and how things were run and was taken out of the national treasury. And the point is, when you think of covert action, and I was speaking earlier today with some of the folks about how little even practitioners in the business understand covert action, which is, as you know, not clandestine spying operations. You have the George Smiley on the spying side, and you have the James Bond boom and bang, if you will, on the covert action side, in really simple layman's terms. It's not a tool of statecraft that's well understood. The part that I think Americans really don't get, and it's interesting that this German case that's out, and I'm quoted in an ABC story, as are two other CIA people. And the issue there is, did the president have to be briefed on an espionage case? And the answer is no. The president of the United States, there is no regulation rule that requires that. Covert action that goes on in Afghanistan, Syria, take your pick. Every action, covert action, has to include a presidential finding. That means the President of the United States has to sign it. During my 32 years there's someone here that actually worked with Rolf Kingston years before, going back longer, and I researched it. And I do not know, and I don't have firsthand knowledge today, but I believe strongly, I know of not a single covert action operation in the history of the agency that was not approved by the President of the United States. Most Americans don't understand that. When you get to the German one, my two colleagues who are quoted are correct. You do not have to brief the President of the United States. But I went on to say you don't have to. But if you think something's going to end up with the President of the United States desk, you should brief him. You know? But there is, again, this theme of action. And when I look back over my career, and one of the beauties of writing a book is you put context, I mean, you put, you know, your life becomes more of a theme. You begin to see the outlines of it. When you're living it, you don't really recognize what's going on. And the reason I can write this book, it's a book about the action part. And so much of it has become public. It allows me, it gives me the ability to write to those things. And the question I have, because Vernon is absolutely right, I've had my hands around many of the major covert action operations in the 70s and 80s and 90s that became public. And the question, I felt very comfortable in the covert action field. I spent half of it in the spying part, which I'm not going to be able to write, you can't write it on agents. But I can talk about the action part. I believe if you actually pull people inside the CIA and the operational directorate, and maybe across the entire agency, 95% of the people would say, get us out of covert action, let us just be spies. And you can even hear some of that resonating today. And I think that really is a poor understanding of your own institution. And by that I mean, when it was set up in the Charter of 47, there's a clause. And it's the entire authority of the CIA is in that clause. Carry out those special activities as directed by the President of the United States. That's the authority. And presidents, the executive, want to be able to have a mechanism between diplomacy and the use of military force to get things done. And if my colleagues don't recognize that that's one of the main reasons that they exist, if they go out to West Virginia, as some proposed, that was when Senator Byrd carried a lot of weight, and just did spying out there, never had to deal with Congress, never had to deal with the state, just spy, they would disappear. Because you really have to have a mechanism that can do things below the radar. One final point, and we'll go back to questions from Vernon again. The book isn't defending covert actions yet. I am advocating that as we pull back, actually been advocating it for years, as we pull back around the world militarily, we need to fill that void with covert action across the spectrum, the arc of instability that we're looking at today. So it's when you, should you read the book, there will be a few that somehow will be auctioned off or whatever. But when you read the book, you should be mindful going into the book where I'm headed, and that is, this is a strong recommendation. Not to throw oil on fire. I'm really very unenthused about nation building. I just had too much experience in Afghanistan and experience in Iraq and Iran to be ever hopeful that those things work out well. And I think one of our colleagues here today was pointing out an op-ed I wrote in July 2010 on Afghanistan, basically casting the way it's folding out. What was delightful in talking to him, he uses it in Georgetown in his class. And the interesting, which I never thought about, he uses it with the students. He knows it's going to polarize them. But do you understand covert action and what its role is and when you use it? And that's one of the nicer things that have been said to me in a while. That someone actually read it, that's the first thing I was worried. Did anyone read it? Did anyone ever understand it? And that's a challenge.